Hey everybody, welcome back to another video on my channel, and yes, you see it correctly, I defended my thesis about server-side rendering capabilities and comparing Next, Nuxt, and Angular and see how fast they are when it comes to server-side rendering. But that's not the topic. Let's talk about Nuxt and testing. When building high-quality and enterprise-level applications, there is no way around one thing. Testing, because honestly, with that complexity and feature scope, you can't test everything manually, and you won't. Don't lie to me, don't lie to yourself, you won't. That's fine, you can admit it. But why are developers so reluctant to write tests? Well, I think first of all, because it doesn't come natural, and then the big question is how? What are good tests? Why? How do I get started? The latter point we'll touch right here, right now, because I will show you how to test stuff in your Nuxt applications, how to write a unit test, and how to do end-to-end testing. As usual, we will go through things based on a demo application and eventually come out with some tests based on the official Test Utils module. And from there, you're good to go and write tests for your own application. Our demo application is quite minimal. This time I added a little bit of style to make sure you don't get a black, white flash all the time. So I hope you appreciate that. But besides that, there's not much going on here. We have an app.vue rendering the AppNumber component, and the AppNumber component basically just says, hey, we use some useState here. If you don't know what useState does, I made a nice video about it, but the idea is that we have some Nuxt internal that we maybe later can, do something with it. So basically think of it as a ref, but like SSR safe. And we render that content down here. Then we have a button to say, hey, let's refresh that. And the refresh will just set it once again to math.random, as also the initial value was a random one. And that's it. That's the whole application. And if we look into the browser, we see exactly that. We see a number. If we refresh it, I'll get a new number. Same with the side refresh. So far, so good. But what do we want to do here now? Well, the idea is we want to make sure that our application works, right? So we want to test a few things. We could consider what do we want to test. And in this example, to show everything around, let's have two scenarios. First, I want to make sure that we have an overview, an end-to-end thing. Let's say that's the most critical part of application, that we actually show that random number and that it's random. How do you do that? Well, we can't really assess randomness, but what we could do is we could say, hey, let's take the number that's there, make sure it is actually a number, click on the button, check it's another number and it's different from the first one. That should, well, almost always work. That's one thing we could check for the big picture. And for the small picture, it would be nice to test that component and see if we can somehow figure out, hey, let's make sure that we can take out the randomness to maybe do some other tests, have it be a more complex one and so on. And maybe somehow can manipulate the useState to always return a static value, which makes it easier for testing, because randomness for testing is always tricky. Let's do these two things, and for each we have a separate chapter, but let's dive right into it. First of all, well, we want to set up the test utils and make sure that we can do all these things. So the setup step will be the same for every option. We'll do that first right now. To set up the test utils, we have to do a few things. First, we need to install some packages, which are the Nuxt test utils, so far so good, vtest as our test runner, the Vue test utils if you want to, so we can mount a few components for unit testing, Happy DOM, which is a nice DOM library for Node.js, and the Playwright core, which we used for end-to-end testing. Okay, so let's run these, do that. And as soon as they're done, well, we can get started. Next thing would be, in our Nuxt config, we add module. So what we want to do here is we want to add Nuxt test utils /module. This is very important. We don't add the main export, we add the module export down here. The reason is that there are various different exports that we will use in a bit. The module one is the entry point right there. And last but not least, if you don't have that already, which is, I guess most of you won't, in your project, add another config, which is a vtest config. That will be the setup for vtest, so for a test runner. And what we will do here is basically just saying, okay, you know what? We can import the define vtest config from Nuxt test utils config. And we just say, okay, we do an export default as we know before. And then here we say test environment Nuxt. If you also have other tests running that are non-Nuxt related tests, you don't want to set the environment here, but we'll come to that in a second. For our use case, that's fine because we don't have any other tests. But if you have other tests, don't set that here, something like that. So whoever will use that will not jump into a pitfall. And we're more or less good to go. So what we can do now is we can write pnpm vtest, and we will see, okay, it will run vtest and it says, oh, no test files found, which is absolutely correct because we don't have any test files right now. Okay, so maybe we want to test that AppNumber component. We start with unit tests. So the idea would be, hey, let's say we take that component here and we maybe somehow make sure that this random part is not really random so that we can assert the text that's printed out. But first, let's create a test file for that. So let's do appnumber.test.ts if you want to. And in here, we need to do a few things. First, vtest allows us to use global imports, and we can do that. But for now, it's easier to just go with the default. So let's do import it and expect from vtest, and we can start straight away. Say, okay, it writer tests can mount the app, or just say mount a component. This is basically like a smoke test, quote unquote, to say, okay, if it can't mount it because it dies, that's a problem. We added a describe here to say describe app number and the name of the component. It's always a bit easier. And then we run the tests here. Okay, and in here, well, what do we do is we say const component is await, and now we can use mount suspended from the Nuxt Test Utils runtime. Here you see another export. We don't really need mount suspended in our case, but it's super useful if you want to test pages or components with suspense to say, hey, let's just wait until the component is mounted and suspense has been resolved as well. Okay, we still do it anyway, because it's good practice. And in here, we would add our app number from AppNumber.Vue. Okay, so far so good. Now, if we want to do something, is like expect component to .vm. It's not null, something like that. Or we can just say component HTML dot contain number. That would be a first good start. Because obviously, if we go back here, there's number. Let's see that the component HTML actually contains that. Now we can write pnpmt. I didn't set it up, so let's just write pnpm vtest, which runs all the test files in our project. And here we see it passes. Just to make sure it's not a flaky test and it's not always passing. Here we see, oh yeah, that doesn't include number, but it included number. Perfect. Great. So we can stay with that. Lovely. Okay, what do we do next? Well, we wanted to say, okay, that's great. It works. It can mount a component, but it returns the state. So we can do the same. We can mount the component as before, but now we want to make sure that this state here is actually printed out here. And the easiest way to do this is if we could set that state somehow, and then ideally just say, hey, it should contain number 3. So what we could do is, let's say, expect component dot HTML to contain, or like, you know what, let's do text, it's a bit easier. And here we do 3. And of course, that works already, but it doesn't. We didn't set anything. That's probably just because a random number in there contains 3, so it's not really helpful. Let's let it fail and see what we'll do here. It is number, colon, and then the number, and then refresh from the refresh button. So let's just do number, colon, 3, refresh. And this will not work. We see it straight away. Okay, so far so good. Why doesn't it work? Well, we didn't set it to 3 so far. How we can do that? Okay, so there's another thing called mock Nuxt import, and it's pretty nifty. The idea is it also comes from the runtime test utils, and in here we can say, hey, let's mock an imported Nuxt auto imports. So let's say useState maybe, and then we say, okay, you know what? this should be a function that always returns 3. And if we save this, it works. It's done. Mock Nuxt import is actually a macro which under the hood uses the vi function from vtest. The problem is you can only use it once per mocked auto import per file because the vi function from vtest is hoisted. That's also noted in the docs. That's why you can't say, oh yeah, in this test, it should be 3, and in the other test, it should be 4. That wouldn't work. So either you can do separate files or you can use a more low-level implementation. But nevertheless, that will work. And of course, there are lots of other ways of dealing with these scenarios. We have other tools on our fingertips. The link to the whole docs is as usual down in the description. If there's anything where you say, hey, could you please maybe explain us how can we, I don't know, test Nitro API endpoints, or hey, how can we change the API-based URL and test or whatever. Also, write it down below. I can't cover everything. This is just a primer. But I'm very happy to hear what you're starting with, and then we'll have a look into that together. But now back to code. All right, the unit test part is done. That's very nice. Now, but we have to do something else because now we test a little bit of the implementation detail, which is not ideal. Nevertheless, let's jump over to the end-to-end test because we want to test a bit more. We actually want to make sure that the application that we see works as expected. And as we can't test randomness, we test that the numbers, as I mentioned before, are changing and are not the same. So how do we do that? Well, we have the setup already. So let's start with an app or maybe an E2E folder and then put in here app.test.ts, something like that. Of course, it makes sense to structure it a bit better when you have a more complicated setup. Of course, once again, we use the vtest things, and now we describe our test, say app, and here put some async things because we need some setup function. So we have the setup from Nuxt Test Utils. We await that, and actually, this is from Nuxt Test Utils E2E. This is very important. So we see E2E for the end-to-end test, and then the other import, we have runtime, which makes very clear which part of Nuxt Test Utils is for what and which works where. So what's the plan here? The idea is, well, we await that setup function, which basically spins up the Nuxt instance. It's pretty cool. And now we write our tests. So let's say test, or also it's the same idea, right? Contains number as string. And yes, we did that already in our unit test, but this is just a very simple example where we don't even need a headless browser. So that's the best part. We can just say, let's get the HTML through await $fetch. And $fetch is here not, and this is very important, not exactly the $fetch from Nuxt. Instead, the $fetch here is also from E2E that basically says, okay, we can fetch a URL. It will be mapped based on which port the server is on, and we get the HTML. That's also all nicely documented. And now we can say, okay, let's make sure HTML contains number. And that should also make us pass. It takes a bit longer because as you see, the server is actually spinning up here, and that works now fine. If for whatever reason we change it to number 1123, we wait a little bit and we will see the test will fail, and that's good. So our test is working. We now can't test for the number 3 because, well, there is randomness. So that might be a bit tricky. But with this, like, working is a bit, yeah, it's a bit hard. We can't really push any buttons because we just get the HTML back. That's not really ideal. So what to do now? Well, it's time for an actual browser, or let's say headless browser. So let's just do the same thing, but with Playwright. Okay, with Playwright, we also do that. We do the whole thing async again. And it's very important to run this. You need Playwright installed. It's also fine. So if you haven't, if you don't have Playwright installed, you see a warning, and then you just have to run pnpx Playwright install, like here, Chromium, and all of it will be installed and it will work. But back to the test. We first get a page, not for create app, but create page, which actually once again comes from the E2E part here. And also we can straight away get the URL. The URL is a nice helper method to actually give the URL related to the port for the setup. So we create a page here, then we say, hey, let's go to the URL of slash, because just slash wouldn't work. We need a full URL with like localhost and so on and so on. And we want to say here, please wait until things hydrated, which is also great. So we don't run into weird issues here. And now we'll say, okay, let's get our text based on page.text content and get it from the span, because obviously we want the whole thing, just the number itself, which is in the span. Ideally, you would work with data test IDs here or with a label or something more descriptive. Right now, that's fine like that. And now we say const number is obviously number text. And let's say expect number to be greater than 0. So let's run it. And I'm very confident that this will work and it's fine. Lovely. How about we test it's greater than 10 or 19? This should all fail because it's a number between 0 and 1, given on how math.random works. And of course, we see 0.13016258645888165 is not greater than 19. Checks out. So back to our test, changed it back to 0. We can also say, hey, okay, is it actually a number? But we're good with that. And that's a good start. So what do we do now? Well, next we want to actually interact with the page. So let's just do page click. And let's say the page should click a button. Then we could technically just do the same thing again and just say, okay, hey, this is new text, this is new number. And we say number not to be new number. So we basically get the new content from the page after clicking the button. So it will be reevaluated and the numbers should be different. And that looks fine. If we change number to be new number here, we'll just do that real quick. Say, hey, they should be equal, which they shouldn't. It will say, that's not the case. So also here, we did the right thing. It's very important to double check the tests so they're not always passing for whatever reason, because maybe you had wrong assumptions, but that's how it works. And the good part is this all works fine in CI. This works out of the box. And here we go. One little remark that I almost forgot is in the unit test. We'll jump back to that real quick. Because as I said before, if you have other tests, then the environment set to Nuxt in the config is a bit tricky. That will not work then. So instead, if you have other vtest tests, you can write in top level on the first line, vtest environment Nuxt, and then this will run in Nuxt. Then we don't need this config here, and we can leave it alone, and we're all good. So then this will also still pass, and it's all fine. If we don't have that, just show you what will happen here. Maybe let's restart the whole process because otherwise it might not show. I had it earlier here. It will just fail because it says, well, it can't really find the Vue app itself, which makes sense because we didn't say it's in Nuxt context. But if we save this, it's all golden. Okay, so we achieved exactly what we wanted. We now can test our application. We see that the numbers are there, that they change. We even, on the unit level, could mock some randomness out, and we're good. Amazing. I think that's a very solid start on testing with Nuxt, both E2E and unit. We even showed how to mock some imports of Nuxt, and trust me, in the docs that are linked in the description as usual, there are lots of other goodies. And once again, here is my idea. If you have something to say, hey, testing this exact part, like as I mentioned, I don't know, Nitro API endpoints or whatnot, is difficult. Do you have any idea? I might have, or at least I have opinions, or I'll figure it out for you. Drop a comment down below, and then we'll have a look together. Other than that, I think we're good for today. Don't forget to check out the newest DejaVue episode because it's an amazing podcast that Michael Thies and I started very, very recently. So please have a look. And other than that, the only thing left to say is take another look at the channel as well. Other videos, if you haven't seen them already. Stay tuned. See you next Friday because there's a video every week. Until then,